devastation. That's the precise moment when an avoidant person finally grasps the irreversible truth. They are losing you for good. This is the moment avoidants realize they're losing you for good, and it arrives not with fanfare or dramatic declarations, but with the quiet, terrible certainty that the door they thought would always remain ajar has finally, definitively closed. You see, my dear viewers, I've spent considerable time observing the intricate dance of human attachment, and there's a particular irony that strikes me as both tragic and inevitable. The very people who spend their lives maintaining distance, who pride themselves on their independence and emotional self-sufficiency, are often the ones who experience the most profound shock when that distance becomes permanent. What fascinates me about avoidant attachment is its fundamental contradiction. These individuals have developed elaborate psychological mechanisms to protect themselves from the vulnerability of deep connection, yet beneath that carefully constructed armor lies the same human need for love and belonging that drives us all. They're rather like master chess players who've spent years perfecting a defensive strategy, only to discover that while they were protecting their king, their opponent has quietly been positioning for checkmate. The moment of realization I speak of today is not merely about losing someone you care about. It's about the collision between psychological theory and raw human emotion, where two powerful forces, the peak-end rule and loss aversion, converge to create what can only be described as a perfect storm of clarity. The peak-end rule, you see, suggests that we judge experiences largely based on how we felt at their peak and at their end. For avoidants, the peak might have been those rare moments of genuine intimacy they allowed themselves, and the end, well, the end is often a cold realization of what they've systematically pushed away. Loss aversion, that cruel master of human psychology, tells us that the pain of losing something is psychologically twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining it. Imagine, if you will, someone who has spent years convincing themselves they don't need something, only to face the prospect of never having it again. The mathematical cruelty is almost elegant. They experience double the pain for something they told themselves they didn't even want. Throughout this exploration, we'll delve into the specific moments that trigger this awakening, the internal mechanisms that finally override years of emotional avoidance, and most importantly, what can be done when this realization strikes. We'll examine real situations where avoidants have found themselves staring into the abyss of permanent loss, and we'll uncover the practical steps that can be taken when the comfortable illusion of endless time finally shatters. This isn't merely an academic exercise in attachment theory. It's an investigation into one of the most poignant aspects of human relationships, the moment when someone realizes that their strategy for emotional survival has become the very thing that threatens their emotional future. The avoidance journey to this moment is often marked by a series of small compromises, tiny retreats, and calculated withdrawals that seem insignificant in isolation, but accumulate into something far more serious. You'll notice that this realization rarely comes during moments of conflict or dramatic confrontation. Instead, it often arrives during quiet moments of reflection, triggered by something seemingly mundane, a change in tone during a phone call, the absence of a usual text message, or perhaps the way someone's eyes have begun to look through them rather than at them. These subtle shifts register in the avoidance consciousness with surprising intensity, cutting through layers of emotional insulation they thought were impenetrable. What we'll discover together is that this moment of realization, painful as it may be, represents a crucial opportunity. It's the point where psychological patterns that may have been decades in the making finally meet the undeniable reality of human connection and loss. The question becomes not whether this moment will arrive, for in many cases it inevitably will, but rather what happens next, and whether the avoidant individual can transform this painful clarity into meaningful change. The story I'm about to share begins with a man named Thomas, a successful architect who had mastered the art of emotional blueprints as precisely as he had mastered building them. Thomas embodied everything we understand about avoidant attachment: competent, self-reliant, privately convinced that needing others was a weakness he couldn't afford. He had been in a relationship with Sarah for 3 years, a relationship that followed the familiar avoidant pattern of closeness, followed by withdrawal, intimacy followed by distance, as predictable as the tide, but far more damaging. Sarah was what we might call anxiously attached. She sought reassurance, closeness, and emotional availability. For 3 years, she had performed an exhausting dance, moving closer when Thomas pulled away, trying to decode his mixed signals, hoping that her patience and understanding would eventually create the safety he needed to fully commit. It was a dance that neither of them consciously chose, but both were powerfully driven to perform. The beginning of the end came not with a dramatic argument, but with Sarah's quiet announcement over coffee on a Tuesday morning. She had applied for a position in another city. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, as she mentioned it as casually as she might mention the weather. Thomas's immediate response was characteristic: a nod, a comment about new opportunities being good for career growth. Perhaps a slight relief that the pressure he felt from her expectations might ease, but something in her tone registered differently this time. What Thomas didn't recognize in that moment was that Sarah had reached what psychologists call the extinction point, the place where someone stops fighting for a relationship and begins the internal process of letting go. Her mention of the job wasn't a bid for his attention or an attempt to provoke jealousy. It was information sharing between people whose futures were diverging, delivered with the emotional neutrality that Thomas had taught her to adopt. Over the following weeks, Thomas began to notice subtle changes. Sarah stopped initiating their usual conversations about weekend plans. She became less available for their typical last-minute dinners. Her responses to his texts remained warm but brief. Most significantly, she stopped expressing frustration about his emotional unavailability. That particular change should have alarmed him, but initially it felt like relief. The pressure was off. She was finally giving him the space he thought he wanted. The peak-end rule began its psychological work during this period. Thomas found his mind returning repeatedly to specific moments. The evening Sarah had fallen asleep against his shoulder while they watched a movie. The morning she had surprised him with coffee and pastries from his favorite bakery just because she was thinking of him. The way her face lit up during the rare moments when he let his guard down and shared something genuinely personal. These memories, which he had initially categorized as pleasant but not essential, began to take on a different quality entirely. The turning point came 6 weeks later during what would become their final conversation. Sarah called to let him know she had accepted the position and would be moving in 3 weeks. Her voice carried no anger, no disappointment, no plea for him to ask her to stay. It was the voice of someone who had already emotionally relocated, who was simply tying up practical loose ends. She spoke about forwarding addresses and returning borrowed books with the same tone someone might use to discuss transferring utilities. As Thomas listened to her matter-of-fact planning, something shifted inside him with almost physical intensity. For the first time, he could hear the finality in her voice. This wasn't another one of their cyclical conflicts that would resolve with time and distance. This wasn't Sarah's attempt to force his hand or create the drama that he believed all relationships inevitably contained. This was Sarah stating facts about her future, a future that had been carefully, quietly, and completely reorganized around his absence. Loss aversion struck him with the force of a physical blow. Every instinct for self-preservation that had spent years protecting him from the vulnerability of deep attachment suddenly reversed its focus. The same psychological mechanisms that had made commitment feel dangerous now made her departure feel catastrophic. His mind began calculating with desperate precision everything he was losing, not just Sarah's presence, but her particular way of remembering his preferences, her patient listening during his difficult days, her ability to find humor in situations that frustrated him. But what made this realization particularly devastating was the accompanying clarity about his own role in creating this outcome. Thomas could see with painful precision how each withdrawal, each emotional retreat, each moment when he had chosen safety over connection had contributed to Sarah's decision to build a life that didn't require his participation. The very strategies that had protected him from short-term vulnerability had created long-term consequences far worse than anything he had tried to avoid. The conversation ended with Sarah's gentle but firm decline of his sudden suggestion that they talk more about this decision. There was kindness in her voice, but no negotiation. She had moved beyond the stage where talking could change outcomes. As Thomas sat in his apartment after hanging up, he experienced what could only be described as the collapse of a worldview. Everything he thought he understood about relationships, about his own needs, about the nature of safety and risk, had been proven not just wrong, but counterproductive. This moment of devastating clarity is what I want you to understand, because it represents something far more universal than one man's romantic crisis. It represents the point where psychological theory meets emotional reality, where the strategies we develop to protect ourselves reveal their ultimate limitations, and where the true cost of emotional avoidance becomes undeniably clear. When we examine what happens to avoidance in this crucial moment, we discover several practical principles that can transform this painful awareness into constructive change. The first and perhaps most important step is what I call embracing the discomfort of accurate self-assessment. This means resisting the natural impulse to minimize the situation or retreat further into emotional isolation. The avoidance instinct when faced with emotional pain is typically to create more distance, to convince themselves that independence is preferable anyway, to rewrite the narrative in ways that restore their sense of control. But this moment of realization requires a different approach entirely. It demands that the avoidant person sit with the full weight of what they're experiencing without immediately seeking escape or rationalization. This is profoundly uncomfortable for someone whose entire emotional strategy has been built around avoiding such discomfort, but it's absolutely essential. The discomfort they're feeling is not a signal that something is wrong with their emotional response. It's a signal that something accurate is finally being acknowledged about their emotional needs. The second principle involves reconstructing the narrative of independence. Avoidants have typically built their identity around the belief that needing others represents weakness or vulnerability that they cannot afford. This belief system made sense given their early experiences, but it often outlives its usefulness. The task becomes learning to distinguish between healthy independence and defensive isolation. True independence includes the capacity to choose connection when it serves your well-being, rather than avoiding connection out of fear. This reconstruction requires examining the stories you tell yourself about relationships. Instead of, "I don't need anyone," the more accurate and healthier narrative might be, "I can take care of myself and also choose to share my life with someone I value." Instead of, "Relationships always become complicated and demanding," try, "Relationships require effort and vulnerability, and I can learn to navigate both." The goal isn't to become dependent or to lose your sense of self. It's to expand your emotional repertoire to include sustainable connection. The third principle is developing distress tolerance for emotional expression. Avoidants typically struggle with expressing needs, fears, or desires directly because such expressions feel dangerous or manipulative. But the alternative, expecting others to intuit your needs, or to tolerate your emotional unavailability indefinitely proves far more problematic in the long run. Learning to express emotions and needs clearly and directly feels initially like speaking a foreign language, but it becomes easier with practice. Start with low-stakes situations and build your tolerance gradually. Practice saying things like, "I enjoyed spending time with you," or "I'm feeling overwhelmed and need some time to process this," or "I care about you, and I'm not sure how to show it in ways that feel comfortable to me." The goal isn't to become emotionally dramatic or to lose your natural thoughtfulness. It's to develop the ability to communicate your inner experience when such communication serves the relationship. The fourth principle involves creating systems for consistent connection. Avoidants often approach relationships reactively, responding to immediate situations without considering the cumulative effect of their choices. Building sustainable relationships requires developing proactive habits that maintain connection even when you're not feeling particularly emotional or social. This might mean scheduling regular check-ins with people you care about, establishing routines that include others, or creating structures that prevent you from disappearing during stressful periods. These systems should feel manageable rather than overwhelming. The goal is to create consistency that doesn't depend on your momentary emotional state. Just as you might maintain your physical health with regular habits rather than waiting until you feel sick, maintaining relational health requires regular attention rather than crisis-driven effort. The fifth and perhaps most challenging principle is tolerating the uncertainty of interdependence. Avoidants typically prefer emotional situations they can control or predict. Healthy relationships, however, require accepting that you cannot control another person's feelings, choices, or responses. You can influence these things through your own behavior, but you cannot guarantee specific outcomes. This uncertainty feels intolerable to someone whose emotional safety has depended on maintaining control. But learning to tolerate this uncertainty is essential for sustainable connection. This means accepting that expressing love doesn't guarantee receiving it, that being vulnerable doesn't ensure safety, and that investing in relationships doesn't promise specific returns. What it does promise is the possibility of genuine connection and the opportunity to experience the full range of human emotional experience. The alternative, the safety of emotional isolation, proves to be less safe than it initially appears, as Thomas discovered in his moment of devastating clarity. Each of these principles requires practice and patience. They represent not just behavioral changes, but fundamental shifts in how you understand safety, connection, and emotional risk. The avoidant person who implements these changes will likely feel initially like they're dismantling their primary survival strategy without any guarantee of what will replace it. This feeling is normal and temporary. What replaces defensive avoidance is not reckless emotional abandon, but rather flexible responsiveness to emotional situations as they arise. So here we find ourselves at the end of our exploration, having witnessed Thomas's moment of terrible clarity and examined the principles that might guide someone through such a revelation. The question that remains is perhaps the most important one. What will you do with this understanding? Whether you recognize yourself in the avoidant patterns we've discussed, or whether you care about someone who exhibits these patterns, the knowledge itself is merely the beginning. The moment avoidants realize they're losing someone for good serves as more than just a wake-up call. It serves as a doorway to a fundamentally different way of engaging with emotional risk and human connection. But doorways, as you know, require the decision to walk through them. The comfortable familiarity of emotional avoidance will continue to beckon, offering the false promise that independence from others equals safety from pain. This exploration should have demonstrated quite clearly that this promise is ultimately hollow. Thomas's story concluded not with a dramatic reunion or a perfectly resolved relationship. but with his decision to begin the difficult work of understanding his own emotional patterns. Sarah had moved forward with her life, having learned her own valuable lessons about accepting what others are willing to offer, rather than hoping they will become different people. But Thomas's realization about what he had lost became the foundation for different choices in future relationships. The peak-end rule and loss aversion had taught him lessons that intellectual understanding alone never could have provided. If you recognize avoidant patterns in yourself, I encourage you to consider this moment not as a failure of your emotional strategy, but as evidence of its limitations. The skills that helped you survive earlier challenges in your life deserve respect and acknowledgement, but they may no longer serve your current situation. Developing new emotional skills doesn't mean abandoning your capacity for independence or thoughtful decision-making. It means expanding your repertoire to include sustainable connection with others. Begin today with one small step toward expressing what matters to you to someone who matters to you. Notice your impulse to retreat when emotions become intense, and consider staying present for just a few moments longer than feels comfortable. Practice tolerating the uncertainty that comes with caring about someone whose response you cannot control. These small actions, accumulated over time, create the foundation for the kind of relationships that enhance rather than threaten your well-being. If you care about someone with avoidant patterns, remember that their emotional distance likely represents a survival strategy rather than a lack of caring. You cannot force someone to change their attachment style, but you can decide what you are willing to accept and for how long. Sarah's quiet decision to reorganize her life around Thomas's absence, rather than continuing to fight for his attention, ultimately served both of them by creating the clarity that intellectual discussions had failed to achieve. The human heart, in all its complexity, seeks both safety and connection. These needs are not contradictory, despite what our past experiences might suggest. The moment of realizing you are losing someone for good can become the moment you finally understand that true safety lies not in avoiding the risks of connection, but in developing the skills to navigate those risks successfully. This understanding, hard-won and sometimes painful, opens the door to relationships that nourish rather than threaten, that enhance rather than diminish, and that prove worthy of the courage required to maintain them. Choose wisely, act thoughtfully, and remember that the capacity for love, both giving it and receiving it, represents not weakness, but the highest expression of human courage. The moment of devastating clarity can become the moment of meaningful change, but only if you have the wisdom to walk through the doorway it opens.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.